The flickering lantern light throws long, dancing shadows across the rough-hewn bars of the cell. Sarah huddles on the thin straw pallet, the chill of the stones seeping into her bones. Outside, the wind howls a mournful dirge around the corners of the small clapboard jailhouse, mirroring the storm of fear and resentment brewing in the town of Redemption. They call her witch, heretic, a bringer of ill fortune. The whispers follow her like flies to a carcass, growing louder with every misfortune that befalls the settlement. Now, young Thomas, the sheriff's son, lies consumed by a fever that Doc Miller has all but surrendered to, and the town's fear has found its focus, its scapegoat, in her. Sheriff Brody stands at the window of his small office, the glass cold against his forehead, his gaze lost in the swirling dust devils kicked up by the wind. His son, his only child, is fading. Every rasping breath tears at his soul. He hears the muttering from the saloon across the street, the fear-stoked anger. They blame Sarah. He has her locked up, as much for her protection as to appease them, but a desperate, unthinkable idea takes root in his despair. She's known for her strange knowledge of herbs, her quiet ways with animals, things that mark her as other in this harsh, unforgiving land. He pushes away from the window, his decision a lead weight in his gut. "She's my boy's only chance," he rasps to the empty room, the words a prayer and a curse. And with that stark admission, born of a father's breaking heart, the fate of the outcast and the soul of the town hang precariously in the balance. There's more to her than meets the eye. Before her true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. Sheriff Brody had taken up the badge in Redemption 3 years prior, after his wife, Martha, succumbed to a lung fever that swept through the territory. He'd come seeking a place to raise Thomas, a place where the air was clean and the past might be buried. Instead, he found a town teetering on the edge of piety and paranoia, its citizens quick to judge and slow to forgive. Sarah arrived a year later, a solitary figure on a tired mare, asking for nothing but to be left alone. She settled in a derelict cabin on the outskirts, a place abandoned after its previous owners vanished during an Indian scare. She kept to herself, trading hand-carved wooden figures and intricate beadwork for meager supplies at Miller's Mercantile. Her knowledge of plants, the way she seemed to coax life from the parched earth around her cabin, was initially a curiosity. But when Old Man Hemlock's prize bull died suddenly after wandering near her property, curiosity curdled into suspicion. When a summer sickness took 3 children, Sarah's quiet foraging in the hills for roots and berries was reinterpreted as something sinister. She became the repository for all their unspoken fears, the shadow they cast to make their own lives seem brighter. Brody remembered the day he'd first encountered her directly. A group of boys, emboldened by saloon talk, had been pelting her cabin with stones. He'd ridden out, dispersed them with a stern warning, and found Sarah standing in her doorway, her face pale but her eyes steady. She hadn't thanked him, nor had she railed against her tormentors. She'd simply watched him, a flicker of something unreadable in her gaze, weariness perhaps, or a profound understanding of human cruelty. He'd felt a pang of discomfort then, a sense of shame for the town he represented. Now, that same town was baying for her blood, convinced she had cursed his son. Doc Miller, a man whose medical knowledge was limited to whiskey for pain and poultices of questionable efficacy, had shaken his head earlier that evening. "It's the Lord's will, Sheriff. The boy's constitution is weak." But Brody had seen the fear in the doctor's eyes, the admission of his own inadequacy. Thomas was strong. He was a fighter, just like his mother. This fever, though, was relentless, burning through him with a terrifying speed. The town's prejudice against Sarah was a palpable thing, thick as the dust that settled on everything. He'd heard the whispers, the thinly veiled accusations. Mrs. Henderson, the preacher's wife, had declared Sarah an affront to God's order. Jedediah Smith, who'd lost his crop to blight, muttered about unnatural influences. Brody, in his official capacity, had dismissed these as ignorant fears, but a small, cold part of him, the part that grieved Martha and now feared for Thomas, had listened. Locking Sarah up had been a concession, a way to quiet the rising tide of panic, to show he was doing something. He told himself it was for her safety too. A mob, fueled by grief and superstition, was an unpredictable beast. He walked across the dusty street, the wind whipping his coat around him. The saloon fell silent as he passed, eyes following him. He ignored them. At the jail, Deputy Hankins, a young man barely old enough to shave, looked up, startled. "Sheriff, thought you were with Thomas." "He's no better, Hank. Open her cell." Hankins' eyes widened. "Sheriff, you ain't thinking. Just do it, son." Brody's voice was gravel. The cell door creaked open. Sarah looked up, her eyes dark pools in the lantern light. She wasn't what he expected. There was no defiance, no fear-crazed glint, just a profound stillness. "My son," Brody began, the words catching in his throat. "He's dying." Sarah said nothing, her gaze unwavering. They say you have knowledge of herbs, healing." He felt like a fool, a desperate drowning man clutching at a phantom rope. Still, she was silent. He could feel Hankins' bewildered stare on his back. The weight of the town's disapproval pressed down on him. "Will you? Can you help him?" The question was a ragged whisper. For a long moment, the only sound was the sighing of the wind. Then, Sarah rose slowly to her feet. She was taller than he remembered, or perhaps it was the dignity she carried that made her seem so. "If he is to be helped," she said, her voice low and surprisingly steady, "it will not be by keeping me in a cage." Brody flinched as if struck. He'd offered her a chance, and she'd thrown his hypocrisy back in his face. He nodded curtly. "You'll come with me, Hankins. You stay here, and keep your mouth shut about this." "But Sheriff, the townsfolk." "I'll handle the townsfolk," Brody said, though he had no idea how. Right then, all that mattered was the faint, shallow breathing of his son. The walk to his house was short but felt like miles. Every curtained window seemed to hold accusing eyes. Sarah walked beside him, her head held high, a small bundle of her meager possessions clutched in her hand. He hadn't allowed her to gather anything from her cabin, only what she had with her in the cell. He was aware of the incongruity, asking for her help while treating her like a prisoner. When they entered the small house, the air was heavy with the scent of sickness and despair. Martha's sister, Clara, a stern, unforgiving woman who had come to help nurse Thomas, recoiled when she saw Sarah. "John, what is the meaning of this? Have you lost your senses, bringing her into this house?" Clara's voice was sharp with outrage. "She's here to help Thomas," Brody stated, his tone daring contradiction. "Help? She's the one who cursed him. The whole town knows it." Clara's face was flushed. Sarah stood quietly by the door, her expression unreadable. It was as if she were accustomed to such accusations, armored against them by long experience. "That's enough, Clara," Brody said, his voice dangerously low. "If you can't abide her presence, you can leave, but she stays." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked from Brody to Sarah, then to the closed door of Thomas's room, her eyes filled with a mixture of fury and fear. Without another word, she snatched her shawl and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. Brody let out a shaky breath. He had crossed a line, alienated his own kin. He turned to Sarah. "The boy's in there." Sarah entered the sick room with a quiet grace that surprised him. Thomas lay small and still in his narrow bed, his face flushed crimson, his lips cracked and dry. His breathing was shallow, punctuated by a rasping cough that seemed to tear through his small frame. Sarah approached the bed, not with the hesitant fear that Doc Miller had shown, but with a focused intensity. She placed a cool hand on Thomas's forehead, her touch surprisingly gentle. "He burns," she said softly, more to herself than to Brody. She opened her small bundle. Inside were dried leaves, roots, a small stone mortar and pestle. Brody watched, a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest as she began to crush some leaves, her movements deft and economical. "What is that?" he asked, his voice betraying his suspicion. "Willow bark," she replied without looking up, "to ease the fever, and valerian root to help him rest." He knew nothing of these things, only what the town whispered, that she communed with spirits, that her remedies were concoctions of the devil. But watching her now, her brow furrowed in concentration, her hands moving with a practiced skill, he saw not a witch, but a woman engaged in a desperate battle. She mixed the crushed herbs with a little water he fetched for her, then gently coaxed a few drops between Thomas's parched lips. The boy whimpered, but swallowed. For hours, Sarah sat by the bed, bathing Thomas's face with cool water, murmuring soft, unintelligible words. Not incantations, Brody thought, but perhaps soothing sounds. Like a mother calming a fretful child, he found himself watching her hands, the way they moved with such certainty, the way she tended to Thomas with a tenderness he hadn't expected. Outside, the night deepened. Brody knew the town would be stirring, word of Clara's dramatic exit spreading like wildfire. He could almost hear the whispers, the condemnation. He had brought the town's pariah into his home, entrusted his son's life to a woman they believed to be evil. If Thomas died, he pushed the thought away. He had made his choice. Now, all he could do was wait and watch and pray to a God he wasn't sure listened anymore. The first hint of dawn was painting the sky a bruised purple when Thomas stirred. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused for a moment, then settled on Sarah. There was no fear in them, only a child's weary confusion. "Water," he croaked, his voice barely audible. Sarah helped him sip, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. Brody felt a surge of something he hadn't dared to feel for days, hope. It was fragile, easily shattered, but it was there. Sarah met his gaze across the small room. "The fever has not broken," she said, her voice flat, offering no false reassurance. "But he is holding his own." He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He saw the exhaustion etched on her face, the dark circles under her eyes. She had not slept, had not rested for a moment. He felt a grudging respect, a tiny seed of something that might, in time, grow into trust. It was a dangerous feeling in a town that had already judged and condemned her. The coming day would bring its own reckoning. The initial test had been passed within the confines of his home. The next would be under the glare of the town. News of Sarah's presence in the sheriff's house and Clara's indignant departure spread through Redemption faster than a prairie fire. By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered outside Brody's home. They weren't overtly hostile, not yet, but their presence was a silent accusation. Preacher Henderson stood at the forefront, his Bible clutched in his hand like a weapon. Mrs. Henderson stood beside him, her lips a thin, disapproving line. Jedediah Smith was there too, his face grim. Brody stepped out onto the porch, his shotgun held loosely in the crook of his arm. He looked tired, his face drawn, but his eyes were resolute. "Go home," he said, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. "There's nothing for you here." "Sheriff," Preacher Henderson called out, his voice sonorous. "We are concerned, for your soul and for the soul of your boy. You have brought a woman of ill repute, a suspected witch, into your home." "She is here to heal my son," Brody said, his jaw tight. "Something your prayers and Doc Miller's tonics couldn't do." A gasp went through the crowd. It was a direct challenge, not just to the preacher, but to the established order of the town. "Healing?" Mrs. Henderson scoffed. "Or a devil's bargain? What price will Thomas pay for such unnatural ministrations, Sheriff?" Brody's hand tightened on the shotgun. He saw fear in some faces, but also a morbid curiosity. He knew he was walking a razor's edge. "The only price being paid is my son's suffering, and Sarah is trying to alleviate it. Now, I'm asking you again, peacefully, to disperse." The crowd shifted, uneasy. They respected the badge, and Brody, despite his current controversial actions, was known as a fair, if stern, man. But their fear of Sarah, fanned by years of suspicion, was a powerful force. "If that boy dies, Sheriff," Jedediah Smith muttered, loud enough for all to hear, "it'll be on your head, and hers." Brody met Smith's gaze. "I'll take that responsibility. Now go." Slowly, reluctantly, the crowd began to break apart, casting backward glances, their whispers following them down the dusty street. Brody watched them go, the tension slowly ebbing from his shoulders. He had bought Sarah some time, but he knew this was far from over. He was now as much an outcast in their eyes as she was. Inside, Sarah continued her vigil. She spoke little, her focus entirely on Thomas. She brewed different teas, applied poultices of crushed leaves to his chest to ease his breathing. Brody found himself observing her, cataloguing the small details. The way she tested the heat of a brew on her wrist, the almost imperceptible frown when Thomas's cough worsened, the faint sigh of relief when he drifted into a more peaceful sleep. He saw no incantations, No strange rituals, only diligent, painstaking care. He remembered his own Martha, her tireless nursing when he'd been struck by swamp fever years ago. There was a similar quiet determination in Sarah, a fierce will to fight the encroaching darkness. He offered her food, but she ate little, only a piece of bread and some water. He asked her about the herbs, where she had learned of their properties. "My grandmother," she said, her voice soft. She was a healer in the old country. Some called her wise, others called her witch too. A shadow passed over her face, a fleeting glimpse of a painful past. "Why did you come to Redemption?" he asked, genuinely curious. She looked at him then, her gaze direct and searching. "I was looking for a place where I could be left alone, where the whispers wouldn't follow." She paused. "I haven't found it yet." Her words were a quiet rebuke, a reminder of his own complicity in her isolation. He had upheld the town's judgment by locking her away. Now he was relying on the very skills that had condemned her. The irony was not lost on him. Days passed in a blur of anxiety and exhaustion. Thomas's condition fluctuated. One afternoon, his fever spiked alarmingly. Sarah worked frantically, bathing him in cool water, forcing sips of willow bark tea between his lips. Brody watched, helpless, his heart constricting with fear. He saw the strain on Sarah's face, the desperate resolve in her eyes. In that moment, he wasn't Sheriff Brody, upholder of the law, and she wasn't Sarah, the outcast. They were simply two people fighting for a child's life. Gradually, painstakingly, the fever began to recede. Thomas's breathing eased, the flush on his cheeks lessened. Sarah slumped against the wall, her shoulders trembling slightly. Brody realized she was as invested in Thomas's survival as he was, perhaps more so, for her own fate hung even more precariously in the balance. A small discovery deepened his shifting perception. He found a worn, leather-bound book tucked into her bundle. Its pages were filled with delicate drawings of plants, their names written in a spidery script, alongside notes on their uses. It was not the grimoire of a sorceress, but the careful record of a botanist, a student of nature's pharmacy. He saw her observing him as he looked through it, a guarded expression on her face. He closed it gently and handed it back. "Your grandmother's?" he asked. She nodded, a flicker of something akin to trust in her eyes. The town remained a brooding presence. Each day, small groups would gather at the end of the street, watching his house. Supplies he'd ordered from Miller's Mercantile were delivered with sullen reluctance. Deputy Hankins reported that the talk in the saloon was growing uglier. There were calls for a trial, for Sarah to be formally charged with witchcraft, or at the very least, with endangering the community. Brody knew that if Thomas worsened, or if he died, he wouldn't be able to protect her. His authority, already strained, would shatter. The thought of losing his son was unbearable, but the thought of handing Sarah over to a vengeful mob was equally repugnant. He was caught between his duty to the law, his love for his son, and a growing, unwelcome sense of responsibility for this solitary, misunderstood woman. One evening, as Sarah spooned a thin broth into Thomas, the boy managed a weak smile. "Tastes good," he whispered. Sarah's hand stilled. She looked at Thomas, then at Brody, and for the first time he saw a genuine, unguarded emotion on her face, a profound relief that mirrored his own. It was a small victory, but in the oppressive atmosphere of sickness and suspicion, it felt monumental. Later that night, as Thomas slept more soundly than he had in over a week, Brody found Sarah staring out the window at the moonlit street. "They still hate me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Some do," Brody admitted. "Fear makes people cruel." "And you, Sheriff, do you still believe I cursed your son?" He looked at her then, at the weariness in her posture, the quiet strength in her eyes. He thought of her tireless care, her gentle hands, the knowledge passed down from her grandmother. "No," he said, the word coming out with more conviction than he'd anticipated. "No, I don't." A small, almost imperceptible sigh escaped her lips. It was not absolution, not yet, but it was a beginning. The external threat from the town still loomed large, but within the walls of his small house, a fragile understanding had begun to take root. The success with Thomas was a small beacon, but it also illuminated the stark reality of their situation. Her life, and perhaps his own standing in redemption, depended entirely on the boy's continued recovery. The pressure was immense, and the path ahead remained fraught with peril. The turning point came subtly, not with a dramatic pronouncement, but with the steady, undeniable return of color to Thomas's cheeks and the growing strength in his voice. The boy began to demand food, to ask for stories, to complain about being cooped up in bed. Each small sign of his recovery was a balm to Brody's frayed nerves, but it also sharpened the impending crisis with the town. Sarah, having coaxed Thomas back from the brink, was now more vulnerable than ever. Her success could be twisted, her knowledge deemed even more unnatural, more dangerous. One morning, Thomas sat up in bed, his eyes bright and alert. "Papa," he said, his voice clear, "can I have some of Sarah's special tea, the one with the mint?" Brody's heart swelled. He looked at Sarah, who was tidying the small room, a faint, almost shy smile touching her lips. She had saved him. There was no other word for it. But the town was not so easily convinced. Later that day, Preacher Henderson, accompanied by two grim-faced elders from the church, Silas Blackwood and Ebenezer Croft, appeared at Brody's door. They did not ask to enter. They stood on his porch like a tribunal. "Sheriff Brody," Henderson began, his tone somber, "we hear tell the boy is improved." "He is," Brody said, his stance firm, "thanks to Sarah." "Or perhaps," Blackwood interjected, his eyes like chips of granite, "in spite of her. Perhaps the Lord has seen fit to deliver the boy from her influence." "Her influence saved his life," Brody countered, his patience wearing thin. "Doc Miller had given up. Your prayers, preacher, while appreciated, were not enough. She has a skill, a knowledge that none of us possess." "A dangerous knowledge, Sheriff," Croft rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across stone. "The kind that sensible folk fear. The town is uneasy. There are calls for justice, for an accounting." Brody knew what they meant. They wanted a trial, a public spectacle to exercise their fears and reaffirm their narrow view of the world. They wanted to make an example of Sarah. "There will be no trial based on superstition and fear," Brody stated. "She has committed no crime." "Some would say consorting with dark arts is a crime against God and man," Henderson said, his gaze unwavering. "Then let them bring proof," Brody challenged. "Not whispers and old wives' tales. Bring me one shred of evidence that Sarah has harmed anyone, and I will do my duty. Until then, she is under my protection." His defiance hung in the air. The three men exchanged glances. They had expected a beleaguered, grieving father, not this resolute protector. "This is not over, Sheriff," Henderson said finally. "The good people of Redemption will not stand for this. There will be a town meeting. Her fate, and perhaps yours, will be decided there." They turned and left, their departure a silent promise of future conflict. Brody watched them go, a cold dread settling in his stomach. He had openly declared his stand, drawn a line in the sand. The confrontation he had dreaded was now inevitable. He went back inside, finding Sarah standing quietly in the hallway. She had heard everything. "They will not rest until they see me punished," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, a simple statement of fact. "I won't let them," Brody said, the words a vow. He wasn't sure how he would stop them, but he knew he had to try. His responsibility had shifted from merely protecting his son to protecting the woman who had saved him. It was a profound, unsettling change. He owed her Thomas's life. He owed her more than he could say. "Perhaps it would be best if I left," Sarah suggested, her eyes searching his. "Tonight, while they are planning." He considered it. It would be the easiest solution, for him at least. She could disappear back into the wilderness from whence she came, and the town's anger might eventually subside. But the thought left a bitter taste in his mouth. It would be an abdication, a betrayal of the fragile trust that had grown between them, a concession to ignorance and fear. "No," he said. "You've done nothing wrong. You won't run like a criminal. We'll face them, together." Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even gratitude, in their depths. She nodded slowly. "Then we prepare for a different kind of healing, Sheriff, the healing of a town's fear." The decision was made. There would be no escape, no quiet departure. They would stand their ground. The countdown to the town meeting had begun, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Their fate, and the moral compass of redemption, would be determined in that public forum. Brody began to think, to plan. He would need allies, however few. He would need to speak the truth, clearly and forcefully. Sarah's quiet dignity and the undeniable fact of Thomas's recovery were their strongest weapons. He hoped it would be enough. The town meeting was scheduled for the following evening in the rudimentary structure that served as both church and town hall. Brody spent the day in a state of heightened tension, aware that every hour brought them closer to a confrontation that could turn ugly. He spoke with Doc Miller, a man humbled by his own limitations. "Sheriff," Doc Miller had said, his gaze downcast, I don't know what that woman did, but it worked. My methods, they were failing the boy. It wasn't a full endorsement, but it was an admission of Sarah's efficacy, a crack in the wall of prejudice. Brody hoped Miller might have the courage to say as much publicly. He also spoke with Hankins, his young deputy. "Hank, I need you to stand with me tomorrow, not against the town, but for what's right." Hankins, who had witnessed Sarah's quiet care for Thomas during a brief visit, nodded, his youthful face serious. "I will, Sheriff. What they're saying about her, it ain't right. Not after what she did for young Thomas." These were small comforts, but Brody clung to them. Sarah, meanwhile, remained calm, almost serene. She spent the day with Thomas, who was now well enough to sit by the window, his small face pressed against the glass, watching the world outside. She showed him pictures in her grandmother's book of herbs, telling him their names and properties in a low, soothing voice. Brody watched them, a strange ache in his chest. This woman, branded an outcast, possessed a gentleness, a quiet wisdom that the town, in its blindness, refused to see. The evening arrived heavy with unspoken anxieties. Brody escorted Sarah to the town hall, Thomas walking beside them, his hand clutching Brody's. The boy's presence was a deliberate statement, a living testament to Sarah's healing. The hall was packed, the air thick with resentment and morbid curiosity. Faces turned as they entered, a wave of murmurs rippling through the crowd. Preacher Henderson stood at the makeshift pulpit, flanked by Blackwood and Croft, their expressions grimly sanctimonious. Brody led Sarah and Thomas to the front, facing the assembly. He felt like a man walking into a den of lions, but Sarah's composure beside him gave him strength. Preacher Henderson began, his voice resonating through the hushed hall. "We are gathered here tonight to discuss a grave matter, a matter that touches the spiritual well-being of our community. A woman stands among us, accused by many of practices that are unnatural and potentially dangerous." He gestured towards Sarah, who stood silently, her gaze fixed on a point beyond the crowd. "She is accused of witchcraft," someone shouted from the back. Other voices joined in, a chorus of fear and anger. Brody stepped forward, raising his hand for silence. "There will be order," he commanded, his voice cutting through the noise. "This is not a witch hunt. This is a meeting to discuss facts, not fears." He turned to the crowd. "You all know my son, Thomas, was gravely ill. Doc Miller will attest he was near death." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This woman, Sarah, whom many of you revile and fear, brought him back. She used her knowledge of herbs, the same knowledge her grandmother used before her, to heal him. Is this witchcraft? Or is it a skill we should be grateful for?" "Herbs can be used for good or ill, Sheriff," Blackwood countered. "Who's to say what dark powers she invoked?" "I can say," Brody said, his voice ringing with conviction. "I was there. I watched her every moment. I saw no dark powers, no incantations. I saw care, diligence, and a knowledge of healing that surpasses any in this town." He then called upon Doc Miller. The doctor shuffled forward, looking uncomfortable. "It's true," he mumbled, avoiding the preacher's glare. I had done all I could for the boy. Her methods, they are unorthodox. But the boy is well, that is a fact." A murmur went through the crowd. This was not the condemnation they had expected from the town's physician. Then Mrs. Henderson rose, her face a mask of righteous indignation. "She is an outsider. She keeps to herself, communes with unknown things in those hills. She is not like us. Such people cannot be trusted. What if this healing is but a trick to lull us into a false sense of security before she unleashes a greater evil?" The fear, insidious and potent, began to ripple through the crowd again. Sarah, who had remained silent, finally spoke. Her voice was low, but it carried a surprising clarity and strength in the tense atmosphere. "I came to your town seeking peace," she said, her gaze sweeping over their faces. "You greeted me with suspicion. I lived quietly, harming no one. You accused me of every misfortune. When the sheriff's son was dying, and your own doctor could do no more, he came to me, a prisoner, and asked for my help. I gave it, not for reward, nor for praise, but because it was in my power to do so. The knowledge I possess was passed to me by my grandmother, a woman who dedicated her life to easing suffering. Is this the act of a witch, or is it simply kindness?" Her simple eloquence seemed to stun the crowd into silence. The word kindness hung in the air, a stark contrast to the malice that had filled the room moments before. Then a small voice piped up. "Sarah made me better, Papa." Thomas, standing beside Brody, looked out at the sea of faces, his own small face earnest. "She gave me nice tea and told me stories about the plants." A child's innocent testimony, more powerful than any adult argument. The tension in the room seemed to shift, to lessen almost imperceptibly. Some faces softened, others remained hard, unconvinced. Brody seized the moment. "You have a choice, Redemption," he said, his voice firm but no longer angry. "You can continue to live in fear, to persecute those you do not understand. Or you can open your eyes and see the good that has been done here. Sarah saved my son's life. She asked for nothing in return. If that is a crime, then I stand guilty with her, for I am the one who brought her to him." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "I am your sheriff. I swore to uphold the law, and there is no law that says healing is a crime. There is no evidence against this woman, only your fear. I ask you now, not as your sheriff, but as a father, as a member of this community, let go of that fear. Acquit this woman, not in a court of law, for she has done nothing to warrant one, but in your hearts." Silence descended, thick and heavy. Preacher Henderson looked flustered, his prepared condemnations rendered hollow. Blackwood and Croft exchanged uneasy glances. The crowd was no longer a unified mob, but a collection of individuals, each wrestling with their conscience. Finally, Old Man Fitzwilliam, a rancher from the edge of town known for his gruff common sense, stood up. "Well," he said, his voice creaky, "the boy's alive. That's what matters, ain't it? My prize mare took sick last spring. If there was someone, anyone, who could have helped her with herbs and such, witch or no, I'd have welcomed 'em. Seems to me this woman did a service." A few scattered nods. A woman near the back, Martha Perkins, whose own child had suffered a fever the previous winter, spoke up. "My little Ellie was sick. If this Sarah has knowledge, perhaps it's a gift, not a curse." The tide was turning, not a flood, but a perceptible shift. The anger was dissipating, replaced by a grudging, hesitant acceptance. Preacher Henderson saw it. He knew when he was beaten. He cleared his throat. Perhaps we have been hasty in our judgment," he conceded, his voice lacking its earlier conviction. "The Lord works in mysterious ways." It was as close to an apology as they were likely to get. Brody knew it was enough. The immediate threat had passed. Sarah would not be formally charged. She would not be run out of town. He looked at Sarah. Her expression was unreadable, but he thought he saw a faint easing of the tension around her eyes. Thomas reached out and shyly took her hand. Sarah looked down at the boy, and a small, genuine smile touched her lips. It was the first time Brody had seen her truly smile. It transformed her face, revealing a warmth he hadn't known was there. The meeting broke up slowly, people drifting out in small groups, their voices subdued. There were no more accusations, only thoughtful, uncertain murmurs. The crisis had passed. The town had, in its own clumsy way, acquitted her. In the days that followed, a subtle change came over Redemption. The fear of Sarah didn't vanish overnight, but it was tempered with a grudging respect, and for some, a nascent curiosity. Children, emboldened by Thomas's recovery and his open affection for Sarah, would sometimes wave at her from a distance when she ventured into town for supplies. Mrs. Henderson still pursed her lips when Sarah passed, but she no longer muttered about brimstone. Preacher Henderson, in his Sunday sermon, spoke vaguely of God's unexpected instruments. Sarah did not change her quiet ways. She returned to her small cabin on the outskirts, but the isolation felt different now. It was less a banishment and more a choice. Occasionally, Someone would leave a small token on her doorstep, a loaf of bread, a few fresh eggs, a piece of cloth, hesitant offerings of peace or gratitude. She accepted them with quiet dignity. Brody found himself making excuses to ride out towards her cabin, sometimes with Thomas, who delighted in showing Sarah a strange rock or a new flower he'd found. There was an unspoken understanding between Brody and Sarah, a bond forged in crisis and shared relief. He no longer saw her as the town's outcast, or even as the woman who had saved his son. He saw her simply as Sarah, a woman of quiet strength and hidden depths, a woman who had faced down fear with courage and kindness. One late afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the prairie, Brody found Sarah tending the small herb garden she had managed to coax from the dry soil beside her cabin. Thomas was happily digging in the dirt nearby. "He seems to have appointed himself your assistant," Brody remarked, a smile playing on his lips. Sarah looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "He has a gentle touch with growing things," she said, "like his father." Brody felt a warmth spread through him at her unexpected, quiet compliment. He dismounted, letting the reins trail. For a few moments they stood in comfortable silence, watching Thomas. The air was filled with the scent of crushed herbs and warm earth. "The town," Brody began, then hesitated. "They're learning." Sarah nodded. "Fear is a hard habit to break, but so is kindness, once it takes root." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the witch the town had feared, but a resilient woman who had endured prejudice and isolation with a quiet grace he deeply admired. He had brought her from a jail cell in desperation, and in doing so, had not only saved his son, but had perhaps, in some small way, helped to heal the town's own sickness of spirit. The acquittal had been a public act, but the true reconciliation was happening in these quiet moments, in the slow dismantling of fear and the tentative growth of understanding. He knew things wouldn't be perfect, but they had faced the darkness and found a glimmer of light. He watched Sarah bend to show Thomas a ladybug on a leaf, her earlier weariness replaced by a soft serenity, and a sense of peace settled over him, as vast and quiet as the prairie sky. The law in redemption still stands, but the hearts of its people have shifted. Sheriff Brody often finds his gaze drifting towards the small cabin on the edge of town, a place no longer synonymous with fear, but with a quiet resilience that saved his son and perhaps a part of the town itself. Sarah, the outcast, continues her solitary life, but the solitude is now her own, respected, and her path to the mercantile is no longer fraught with whispers, but with the occasional, hesitant nod of acknowledgement, a silent testament to a profound change. Thomas, healthy and bright, is a living bridge between two worlds, a daily reminder that healing can come from the most unexpected hands. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion overcoming prejudice and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.